Greetings, welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Sunday, September 28th, 2025, and on Sundays we talk about the purpose and meaning of life. And this week we're going to be looking at genius all week. We're going to be examining the most enlightened geniuses, figures if you will, in each of the different fields that we cover in the daily vlogs. So, since we're dealing with the purpose and meaning of life today, then we're going to be looking at my top picks for the thinkers, the philosophers, and so on, who have looked at these issues and from whom I've learned a great deal. So there are, of course, many others, and then there are those who speak different languages or written in different languages that I haven't read or perhaps not been exposed to. And so I have to acknowledge my bias up front. And I'm also not including the great oral traditions, right, such as what I've learned from Buddhism over the years. So I'm just considering people that have written down their ideas and obviously those that I've read or been exposed to. So it cannot be a definitive list. It cannot be considered correct by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a reflection of my own, my own experiences, and based on what I've learned, what I've tried to apply over my lifetime. So the key question we're considering is what is the meaning of life? Okay, and that question alone can mean different things to different people. Right? Are we talking about meaning in the sense of what's the main purpose of our being here on this planet and in this form? Is it a question about doing something important with one's life? Is it just about how to make sense out of reality? Or are we talking about being connected to something greater like God or the universe? Or maybe a combination of all of the above? So here are my top 5 geniuses, at least from whom I've personally learned a great deal about the purpose and meaning of life. And then I'll share a favorite quote or two along the way as well. So at number 5, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, professor. He lived from 1889 to 1976, and whose Being in Time was published in 1927. And so that's the Heidegger with whom I'm somewhat familiar, and where the answer to the question seems to be about living an authentic life. So the sociologist in me acknowledges up front that while we're all products to some degree of our societies, of our communities, and so on, Heidegger wants us to strive to move beyond the fixity, the determinism of our communities, to live a life of authenticity. And so that means living a life that we ourselves choose as best we can, not the life prescribed by our families, by our social situations, our status in life, by our society writ large. So to live a life of authenticity then requires that we have a plan, something that unifies our life into a kind of organic whole. A meaningful life requires focused authenticity, being true to what we genuinely believe to be our heritage and the deepest reflection of who we are. And you can appreciate the challenge that might entail, because we usually reap much greater rewards in terms of social acceptance and praise and money or whatever else we're striving for if we live our lives in accordance with everyone else's standards and expectations. So one of my favorite Heidegger quotes is, "Anyone can achieve their fullest potential. Who we are might be predetermined, but the path we follow is always of our own choosing. We should never allow our fears or the expectations of others to set the frontiers of our destiny." All right. Oh, and then on the last part of that, every man is born as many men and dies as a single one. So who are you going to become? What are you going to die as down the road? All right, at number 4, Aristotle, the Greek polymath who lived from 384 to 322 BC. I studied some classical philosophy. I studied ethics in university. I'm by no means an expert of any kind. But the reason I placed Aristotle here, and actually I guess some would place Aristotle at number 1 depending on their list or for other reasons, but it's because he had some important ideas that have stood the test of time, and especially in regard to today's issue. So Aristotle started from the premise that there must be something unique about the human condition that allows us to function as human beings, and it's something that differentiates us from all other species, if you will. And it's our psyches and our souls, in concert with our ability then to use our reason, that sets us apart. And as such, Aristotle developed, among other things, his philosophy of the golden mean, with which I'm sure some of you are familiar. The virtuous person's able to balance between too much and too little to achieve the good life. The optimal life of virtue consists of when we use our capacities deliberately to achieve eudaimonia, the ultimate happiness and well-being. We usually simply describe this idea these days in terms of human flourishing. And so again, that can only be achieved though through good character, right? Ethical and moral behavior and excellence. So a quick editorial in that regard. It's often incredibly difficult to observe these days, especially amongst our most public and especially political figures. Okay, so, but Aristotle was also enough of a social scientist then to recognize that to achieve this requires habituation, requires practice, particularly being exposed to great role models and teachers, and then learning from experience to consciously choose what's best and virtuous. A key quote: happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, and whole aim and end of human existence, end quote. So Aristotle identified, again, happiness being the ultimate goal in human life, achieved through virtuous living and fulfillment of one's potential. Okay, at number 3, Epictetus, the former Greek slave who lived from 55 to 135 CE, whom I only discovered really much later in my life when I became attracted to Stoicism. Why would that be, or how so? Well, basically because his philosophy it lies in part at the heart of cognitive behavioral therapy, suggesting that we can control our feelings mainly by changing and controlling our thoughts, if you will. And Epictetus wrote, among other things, all suffering, he holds, all suffering is in our minds. It is not caused by external events, but by our reaction to those events, by our faulty judgments and unrealistic expectations, end quote. And so because most external events are indeed beyond our control, Epictetus believed that it's pointless then to worry about them. But our evaluations of these events, are entirely within our control. And so in general, then Epictetus taught us that we should not attach deep significance to any external phenomena per se or circumstances. And instead, we should redirect our mental energies to consider a more rational approach to our fact-checking and what we're keeping in our heads. And I can't stress the importance of that in the contemporary world, right? Because we're in a wash in this constant flow or flood of unfiltered information, especially from our online sources and social media feeds, and not to mention the flood of text messages and other forms of communication in our more immediate social circles and our work environments. And so how much genuinely important or significant information comes from all of this? Or stated more harshly, how much filth are we exposed to that pollutes our minds and drives us away from our main purpose in life? And so for Epictetus, the main point is to reconfigure our thinking to realize that every circumstance represents an opportunity, such as preserving and developing our character and anything else we might choose to value. And that's not the same thing as desires, which we all have, of course. We're all burdened with, quite frankly. And that's where Buddhism, by the way, comes into play as well. But from Epictetus, he taught that freedom's achieved not by satisfying desire, but rather by eliminating desire as best we can. As in Buddhism, our desires are our main source of our suffering. And so a life filled by or animated by desire, which can never be sated, is going to be a life of deep suffering. Again, that doesn't mean you cannot feel. You have no emotions. That would be silly. That's not what Stoicism is really all about. We're all human. It's a natural part of our being. For Stoics, the issue is one of self-mastery. That is to the point where we can endure anything and everything that life might present us. Okay? Having a Stoic mindset, or developing one, at least from this perspective, is our most noble purpose in life. And then our ultimate reward in that sense is the inner peace that it brings. All right, and then this leads me naturally into number 2, okay? And I'm going to refer to one of the 2 people whose works I've read directly. I've read others as well, but 2 of the most influential pieces that I've read about surviving the Holocaust. And so if you've not done so yet, I'm going to recommend you pick up a copy of Elie Wiesel's book, Night, just N-I-G-H-T, simple title, which you can read start to finish in one evening. And that's exactly what I did many, many years ago. I couldn't put the book down, quite frankly, in reading about his life, his experience of surviving Auschwitz, which I then later visited in 2007. But for my number 2 genius here, I'm going to actually go with the second person here, Viktor Frankl, the Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist and philosopher and Holocaust survivor as well, who founded logotherapy. So his autobiographical work, Man's Search for Meaning, had a profound impact on me when I read that some years ago. And in the book, he describes how those who survived in the concentration camps, as he did as well, were mainly those who were able to connect with a purpose in life, something to feel positive about. Those who could identify a purpose and then kind of throw themselves into that purpose, each in their own way, had a much better chance of survival. It might have even just been with an imaginary loved one with whom you could have a conversation. And that's, these were the people who basically were best able then to survive the pain, the cruelty to which they were subjected on a daily basis. And so the identifying purpose in one's life could include one or more of the following. There were three main ones. One is the objective of completing daily tasks to provide, again, some kind of clarity and order and having concrete objectives. So that would be one important sort of adaptive mechanism. Second, there's the objective of caring for another person and looking after them and their well-being. That can be an incredible source of inspiration, as many parents can attest. And then third, there's the idea of finding meaning in one's life by facing suffering with dignity, not allowing oneself to be turned into an animal, and by retaining one's humanity under all circumstances. So again, I cannot myself imagine having lived through or surviving the Holocaust, but I take the point that the only chance I might have had would be if I were able to rethink the purpose and meaning of life in the way that Frankl and the others did. I certainly have learned and been changed by their stories, by learning about how they endured the ultimate suffering. And it's also one of the reasons why I've chosen to make studying violence the main source of much of my life's academic work. Okay, and so here's a quote from Frankl that summarizes the whole approach in philosophy in a nutshell. Quote, "There's nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life," end quote. Okay, and finally then at number one, I'm going to bring my U.S. upbringing is going to be my background, all of that. That's going to be my main bias here. Plus, I had this great professor in the last course that I ever took in university as an undergraduate, a U.S. Literature course. And so I learned about everything from the work of the great author James Baldwin going back, I'm kind of reversing the order here, but to transcendentalism and the perennial philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And I almost decided to pursue a degree in English based on that course alone. I was just so intrigued by everything that I was learning. Anyway, I'm going to give the nod, though, to Emerson for my top pick here, partly because he worked for a time as a clergyman, and I entertained the thought at one point, believe it or not. Yes, I started studying at age 19 with the idea of entering seminary and becoming a Catholic priest. And so I took that quite seriously for about 6 months, but nonetheless. And instead, Emerson founded the truly first kind of original U.S. philosophical school of thought, which we know as transcendentalism. Okay, he lived from 1803 to 1882. He founded the Transcendental Club along with Frederick Henry Hedge on September 12th of 1836 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the main outline and expression of transcendentalism was published that same year in an essay in the journal Nature. And then his speech the next year, The American Scholar, was once described by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. as America's, quote, intellectual declaration of independence. And here's the key part that I especially like, or that drew me in, and which resonates with other, religious and spiritual and universality traditions, if you will. So Emerson was a pantheist and believed that God was in everything and in everyone. And to truly express this divinity, he felt, one has to find out who they truly are and then live our lives of individuality as best they're able. And so to do this, Emerson suggests self-reliance and independence and a wariness of society and its pressures to conform. Again, we see that in Heidegger as well. And so I read his work in that class, and I've gone back to it since then, but especially his work, Self-Reliance. And I was especially moved by what I learned. And I have many favorite quotes from that work, but here's one of my all-time favorites. Quote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines," end quote. And finally, I should mention too that Emerson reminds us that the dull and ordinary parts of our lives are actually filled with divine grace. And so his individualism encourages us then to find out who we truly are at heart, acknowledge that, and even, if you will, like Emerson, be willing to go forward with that uniqueness, even though we might be seen as radical by others. In fact, in high school, for reasons not quite as sophisticated as all I've just been describing, my nickname was Calm Radical. Not making that up. Not because I was this radical leftist seeking to overthrow the US government or capitalism, but rather because of my willingness to, dare I say, just calmly state my position, be willing to stand out, even if my perspective wasn't the most popular. And I think perhaps even more to the point is because as the calm radical, I was always sort of pretty much willing to talk to just about anyone. Not because I was especially social, but I just never really fully understand the idea of these social cliques. And I kind of always remained on the margins of all of them as best I could. And the point being that I was kind of always willing to, basically extend an offer to anyone and everyone, no matter, again, who they were, what they looked like, who their clique was, their social status, or what have you. I wasn't the center of anything, but rather just someone who was always kind of sensitive to wherever people were and where they were coming from, if you will. But especially if they were more on the margins or if they were having problems. I could always sort of sense human suffering. And those kinds of folks, by the way, would often gravitate towards me for whatever reasons. And even years later, after high school, I'm always, this is true, especially my mom were alive and others, I tell you, such and such called. I said, oh, I haven't heard from them in a long time. But for whatever reasons, people would call me all the time. Many years later, people I hadn't talked to in years. So somehow we would forge these connections that would endure. Anyway, unfortunately, and especially when I was younger, I too could be a source of pain and suffering of others because I was troubled and struggling in my own ways. But eventually, thankfully, I kind of grew out of that side of things. And more importantly, I sort of made a lifelong goal of trying to help rather than hurt others. And I think that makes me all the more radical today, even in my 60s. In fact, when my father died, I was only 26 at the time, and it was quoted in one of the eulogies that was delivered that day that my father used to say, and this is what he used to say, and this is an old expression, it's attributed to many people, but he used to say, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're older, you have no brains. And so I think I'm a scarecrow. I'm like the scarecrow now from The Wizard of Oz with no brains because I'm more radical than ever in many respects. And with one specific belief in particular, I believe that every person that exists has a voice, has something to say, has a light within them, and is worthy of dignity. Now, at the same time, I'm a realist. I understand that some people out there are causing real pain and suffering. They've been corrupted by society, by their ideologies, by their families perhaps, or by their own troubled personalities. And they've turned away from the light within themselves. Okay, so I recognize that there's some people out there that means that sort of have to be removed from society because they're such an imminent threat to others, a danger, because of their destructiveness and so on. I get that. So again, they've turned away from the light, whether in terms of attacking people randomly on the street, because some people do that, or attacking whole groups of people because of their disfavored status, their demonized whole groups that they've learned to hate. Those folks, whoever they are, and if you're one of them, you're turning away from the light that's within you. The real shame, of course, is that we've tended to elect so many officials to the highest offices, I should say, in many countries, and we're saddled with the collective memories, for that matter, of how much we hate this or that group because of past atrocities, real or imagined, because of the threats, the menaces that they've posed to our people and our kind. And so we have national borders, and we have armies, and we have wars, and we have walls, and we have gated communities, and we have lots of laws, hoping that all of this stuff will protect us and our kind. And we even have our own gods too, which obviously favor our people and our own kind. And so in this sense, then, I'm sort of the antithesis of a conservative. And that is, to me, that kind of conservatism is the enemy of progress, the ability to change and move in the direction towards a state of enlightenment. You can't get there by standing still. You certainly can't get there by going backwards or by clinging to the past and all of the prejudices that we thought would help preserve us and protect us from everyone else not like us. So you cannot become enlightened without learning, without growing, without changing, without recognizing God or the Creator or the universe in every single person in every single moment. In other words, you cannot become enlightened without moving towards the light in yourself, in our souls, in our universe. And that's what I've identified. That's why I've identified, I should say, Heidegger and Aristotle and Epictetus and Frankl and Emerson, among others, as the top 5 who have contributed to my own understanding of the purpose and meaning of life. And by the way, I could do another vlog next week on the same topic, and I might arrive at 5 different people on the list. Okay, well, until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And may you every day be more and more enlightened. Peace.